Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 382 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with one of the founding members of Craft Equity. This is a group that has come together to share personal stories from the field of craft that expose systemic inequities and imbalances of power. By sharing these stories, the group aims to hold craft institutions accountable, and accountability is one of the topics that we talk about during the interview. The way the project works is that people submit their personal stories to craftequity.org. Those are then put up on the Instagram page, which can be found under the same name. The person's voice has been anonymized, and I actually don't even know who I talked to, but I wanted to thank them for taking a leap to put this project together along with their cohort. If you'd like to submit your own story, again, you can do that through the website. That's craftequity.org. Before we get to that, I'd like to thank the folks that have donated to our podcast. We are listener supported, so I'd like to thank Melanie Hassel and Julianne Shibata for their recent contributions. I couldn't make the show without the generosity of folks like those, so I'd like to thank them as well as all the other folks that have donated over the years. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do that at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So let's start talking about Craft Equity, how it came together.
The organizing team is a group of craft artists, and we work in each of the traditional mediums. So clay, glass, metals, wood, textiles. A couple of us had been having conversations about equity work we'd seen craft institutions start to do. A lot of as the result of going back to the Trump election or Black Lives Matter protests to the murder of George Floyd. And we had seen some work being done or started, but frankly not going fast or far enough. And I at least started to realize that craft institutions have been lagging behind in DEI work, partly as a result of the fact that there's very little public pressure on them. So craft institutions tend to be small. They don't get as much press as like MoMA or, the Whitney Biennial, right? So there are big protests, successful boycotts and strikes that happen at those institutions. That doesn't really happen in craft. And so we thought that we should create some public pressure. And we were inspired by an Instagram account, well, several of them, but mostly Change the Museum. And we have followed their model pretty closely and are grateful for the example.
They're a great feed. I hope people that follow them will also follow Craft Equity, because I think you guys are in a similar vein. I think that with Change the Museum, they're talking specifically about the museum world. What do you guys think is your purview of the group? Like, what communities are you trying to reach?
Well, that's a difficult question in some senses because craft is part of larger institutions everywhere, right? So because of the focus that we want to have on structure and policy, we're thinking of institutions like museums that show craft, also craft schools, and to some extent galleries, and university departments, academic craft programs. But craft also exists in so many other places that have less oversight and structure. Community wood shops down to like individual apprenticeships, fabrication studios, that don't have like any policies in place to protect people. And we are interested to see the gamut of harm being done and reactions and possible solutions to that harm.
Can you talk about how it actually works, like the role of people submitting their stories and how someone might read that on the feed?
We use a Google form the same way that Change the Museum does. And you can find that through the link in our Instagram bio and also on our website, which is craftequity.org. So the Google form collects your story. You check a box that gives us permission to share your story on Instagram, and you say that the content of the story is accurate to the best of your knowledge, and you promise that anyone who was harmed in that story has given you permission to share. And then you write down your story in an answer field. You choose whether you want the person or institution that has harmed you to be tagged or identified. And that's kind of it. It goes into the Google responses, and then we take it from there. We put the information into slides and captions, and we post it. We don't edit anything except for minor typos that we think were unintentional. So it's important to us that we just be kind of a pass-through. We're not taking any editorial oversight. We're not changing anybody's words. We are not vetting any stories. So we're just reporting them as they've been told to us.
Yeah, you mentioned the word reporting. Can you talk about the role of the group as being someone who's observing or reporting on the greater craft community? Because I feel like a lot of our magazines, what they report on is the sale of objects. They're not necessarily reporting on the people, and if they are, it's what we consider almost like fluff pieces. So can you talk about the role of Craft Equity as a reporting or an organization that does reporting?
Now I'm thinking about using that word again because you're making me reconsider, because I don't want to imply that we're journalists. We're not. There are various capacities that we want to be careful about the limits of our skill sets. So to your point, there's not a lot of reporting about what it's like to be a craft artist, I think. And certainly because artists have objects for sale and need to present a certain kind of narrative, it's in your interest to sweep these stories under the rug. But of course, that can perpetuate like cycles of harm, and it means that things that might have been correctable many years ago are still going on. And I think that's partly due to structure in craft that, as I said, institutions are small. We all kind of know each other. We don't want to talk badly about our friends or our colleagues. It's also a culture that's really values legacy. And so you don't want to say anything bad about your mentors or your teachers either. And that kind of institutional or personal mentorship to apprentice relationship is so important here. But again, that disincentivizes people from speaking out when something bad happens to them. So we wanted to kind of fill that gap, not as an indictment of craft as a field, but as, I think, an important correction to the record.
Yeah, one of the aspects is that it is anonymous. Like when people are writing, they could tag an organization or an individual, but they're not tagging themselves. As far as I know, no one has personally signed their post, right?
That's true. Yeah, and people have the option to identify themselves in the comments afterward if they like, but that's not been a thing we've seen a lot of. And I do think it's important that that posts are anonymous for a couple of reasons. One is that people who are telling their stories fear retaliation, and that is a real and legitimate fear. And the second is that I think the anonymous stories tell us what craft is like as a whole structure, as a field. So in some senses, it's less important who the offending person or place is. and more important, that you read it and you think, oh yeah, this happened somewhere near me, or I've heard a similar story. They're really the kind of the through lines of patterns of behavior or what stands out to me.
Yeah, and I think a part of the anonymity also, you mentioned that people can be retaliated against, and I also think that when people are not anonymous, there are trolls out there that are just, I mean, it's a form of retaliation, but it's almost like trolls that have no connection to the event might say, well, I just want to jump in and be horrible to people, which I'm sure there have been bad people in our history, but something about the online world generates this form of trolling that wasn't there, probably when we were even kids. I don't think that happened. I think that is a relatively new phenomenon.
In one sense, I think you're right. I think that anonymity of people commenting on posts emboldens trolls, and we've had a couple. But I would say that I have been pleasantly surprised to see our original hypothesis borne out, which is that people are having generative and honest discussions, even in the comments on the post. I think it's easy to think of the internet as like this big mob that's like ready to descend on you at any second. But in fact, what we've seen is that people have nuanced responses. They're capable of weighing evidence and, standing up for people or places that they believe in, counter offering their own experiences in a way that I think is really fruitful.
I'm glad you're saying that, because when I mentioned trolls, I was thinking even more about how something like this, I don't think works as well on Twitter, because there is more of a trolling culture on Twitter. In Facebook, people love to argue. So what is it about Instagram itself that allows anonymity to happen in some sense, but also engages the community in a way that's not immediately negative?
That's a really good question. I think we chose Instagram because that's where the artists are. That's a pretty simple answer, is that we as crafts people value the visual and the object. The graphic quality of Instagram is really important for that. I don't think I know enough to make a really good argument about differences between arguments on Twitter and on Instagram. I do think that there's something algorithmic about hashtags on Twitter that tends to amplify certain events over others, and maybe that's less pronounced on Instagram. But I also like that you can just see all the comments on one thread without interruption or broken up by different responses. I think so. It seems a little bit more like a natural conversation.
I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about movements that have come in the most recent years, like Me Too, where people were divulging abuse that had happened to them, and the groundswell of support that came after the initial people disclosing their own personal history. I mean, even the hashtag Me Too, it's an affirmation that, like, yes, I have gone through this. So can you talk about the empathetic value of seeing someone else's experience and relating to it?
I want to start by saying that, again, I think the anonymity is important there, that people can feel safe telling their stories and be offered a supportive and witnessing space for that is really has the potential to be incredibly healing. I think it's important for this reason that we don't vet posts. What I want is for people to submit their story and to feel that they will be believed. And while I think people might have some concerns about slanted stories or even false accusations, although that's very unlikely, what I want is to establish a atmosphere of trust so that we always believe that people are acting in good faith and being brave about telling their stories. So really just what I think craft equity can offer is listening, just listening to people tell you what happened to them. So it's important for the person who's submitting the story and also the people who are reading it, who can listen and absorb that information think about what that means for people and places in their own lives and have a discussion about it with other people who are interested. And that kind of empathetic environment, I think, can also help us hear hard stories that need to be heard and do it in the least damaging way possible to those who have already been harmed.
Do you ever have people that get in touch later down the road and say, thank you so much for this? I made a post and it's really helped me to deal with the internal trauma of an event in the past?
Yeah, we have. And it's really gratifying to hear. It makes us feel good about what we're doing. Yeah, it's been wonderful how many people have DM'd us or sent an email saying thank you for making this space, that it was necessary.
Yeah, I feel like creating that empathetic space on social media is something that it's funny. Social media can go two different directions. It can be completely superficial and just like no emotional control beyond, the saccharine emotions of happiness and all that stuff, which is not bad. That's a certain level of interaction. But I think when I often read the posts on craft equity, it draws me into an emotional space that I just didn't have through social media before.
Yeah, it's really touching. I think it's intense in a way that you don't often, that's hard to scroll by immediately. And I'll say, just like speaking for myself, that it's been really heavy to hear all people's stories come in. Obviously, we started this project because we knew there was a problem, but I have been really struck by the scale of it and by how many people feel like no one is listening to them.
Can you talk about the term accountability? Because that's something that I hear equity groups that I've been involved with before talk about. Like, we need to hold these institutions accountable or these people accountable. It's a tremendously hard thing to do. So can you talk about, personally and from the group perspective, how do you think accountability works through a project like this?
We are thinking of accountability as a goal that we want to accomplish through public pressure. What we want for craft equity is for institutions to hear what people's experiences have been there, and hopefully, in a good world, people in leadership at those institutions, that would be enough to convince them that issues of equity are urgent. But I also think it's important not to rely on that. So what we want is for institutions to feel the threat of a damaged reputation just by people seeing the story and saying, hey, what are you doing about this XYZ museum? What methods are you putting in place to make sure this doesn't happen again? How did this happen in the first place? We want to provide an amplification for those kinds of demands. And the demands will be specific to every story, but we thought it was important to find a gathering place for the field where we could make those demands together. There's power in numbers.
And how do you find that the institutions respond?
We've only had a couple responses so far. We've only had a couple institutions named so far, and those have been Penland and Haystack, and both craft schools. And they've responded through comments on the post, both, I think, very thoughtfully. I was pleased to see that.
And I think what all of this discussion of DEI is highlighting is that a lot of the institutions have no reporting measures. I'm glad that there's a space for people to talk about in real time the experiences that they're having, because oftentimes it's down the road when someone is talking about it because they're afraid they're going to be retaliated against.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there are lots of people who don't report events or altercations or abuses because they don't know who to go to, or they don't think they'll be believed, or they don't think anything will come of it. And that's honestly realistic because HR departments at museums or student advisory services at universities are only capable of doing so much. And so I think the Me Too movement has taught us that just because there have been consequences for someone doesn't mean that there are always consequences for everyone. A lot of people, get away with bad behavior. And reporting mechanisms vary so broadly from having, an HR rep that you can go to that in a dedicated department in your large institutions to literally nothing because it's you and the potter you work for fabricating slipware, and it's the two of you. So who are you going to report to? So those kind of individual environments make it really difficult to track any kind of meaningful data set across the field. And part of what we're looking for with telling people's stories is to make those public and make that information findable.
Can you talk about how we might build institutions that have equity built into the foundation? I think a lot of times when we have imbalances of power, that then creates abuse. So if we can create structures that don't have that imbalance of power from the get-go, then I hope that we can make more progress with equity as a whole. So do you have any thoughts about that, like the structures of institutions that are more equitable?
I don't think there's any one fix that would make institutions equitable. If there was, if please tell me. But I do think that there are priorities that can be put in place. In my opinion, most of those come down to money. So what are you funding? What are you spending your time on? Who do you have dedicated staff for? And that means putting money aside for scholarships, making equity like core of who you're kind of inviting into the building. It means diversifying your stakeholders. So who do you think you're accountable to as an institution? Who are the communities you answer to? And if you're saying it's our wealthy donors, then you're probably going to have a problem, right? Because those people are going to be mostly white and entrenched in a system that privileges them. So your viewpoint is always going to be off. I think that meaningful DEI work means reallocating resources.
One of the ideas that I've heard people talk about more recently is external review and asking organizations that they are paid by the organization that's being reviewed, but the idea of an external review board that can look at procedures, policies, and ultimately, the activities of the staff and give commentary or suggestions, because unfortunately, HR always represents the company. And if there is an external review board, they can see things that the staff and the institutions don't. It doesn't always mean that the administration is going to take their advice. But I'm glad that I'm starting to see organizations talk about, like, we've hired this consulting company to look through our HR policies to find discrimination that we're not seeing.
I think external review was a great idea. I think institutions should invest in it and in DEI training for their staffs and boards. I also think that that's not a perfect answer, right? Because there is kind of an institutionalization of complaint where doing the work of DEI training means you're addressing the problem, but really that can just go in cycles where you address a problem that creates a new problem, etc. So I don't think that is an easy solution either. And of course, as you said, HR departments are maybe often misinterpreted as meaning that they are resources for humans.
So I thought that I would read an example of one of the posts so that people can understand a little bit about what we're talking about. This was a post from quite a few weeks ago, and this gives you an example of the style. This is from June the 17th. The person says, an art professor colleague shared at a faculty meeting that he had bad news. The news was that one of his students is pregnant by her loser boyfriend, and that she refuses to get rid of the thing. And this is in quotes. He then proceeds to describe her as a star student who will no longer be able to even hold a paintbrush again because of her future as a parent. He shares a variety of violent images he has, including throwing her Oof. Throwing her onto a horse or something to get rid of it. This is all said in front of multiple art faculty members of various caregiving roles outside of their teaching and studio practices, including myself, a mother of two. Oh, and I happen to still hold my paintbrushes every day and with paint on them too. That is so heavy. Like, I don't really know what my question is, but I wanted you to maybe just comment on what a post like that does for you individually.
I mean, it horrifies me. I feel terrible for the student and for everyone witnessing it. It reminds me how deeply entrenched patterns of sexist thought are. That this is the thing that happens and that people expect to happen. That's not something you react to with shock. So yeah, I think that this is the thing, an attitude that's familiar to literally all women. You know, that when you have a child, that's the end of your career. That if you have a child, you don't take your career seriously. That people of other genders, men especially, are not equal caregivers. That it will be that your child is automatically you're the primary caregiver for that child is assumed. I don't know if this is tangential, but craft has such an emphasis on individual identity, and there are very like Emersonian streaks to that about self-reliance and the work of your own hands, and very like libertarian streaks about, you know, living on the land by yourself, don't tread on me kind of stuff. So in the crafts, people react to caregiving as an intrusion often. And that's definitely changing as, you know, the culture around us is changing, but that's a thing that I see often. And so when I read this story, it rang very true to me.
And I think this points to our institutions often underfunding the parts that are intrinsic to the students' lives. So for instance, the university I went to had 51,000 students. It was gigantic. There was no way that they could handle even a tenth of the students having children themselves. So I think that as institutions, hopefully if they read something like this, they can start thinking about, well, what is a reasonable amount of childcare that could be provided to the student body?
Yeah, I would hope that an institution reading someone in a leadership position there, or, you know, a student there who wants to advocate, could read that and bring it to someone who could maybe do something about it. I have to say that I am sympathetic as well to institutional leaderships. They do not have it easy, especially in large or public universities. Like, that is a crisis of underfunding that is not their fault. So this is one of the multitude of ways in which craft institutions are embedded in a larger society and an economy that does not fund education or the arts.
Those schools I went to are in southern states with conservative legislatures that actively cut funding either during the time I was at the university or right after. So I think that is a systematic problem. I wanted to back up from the posts and the experiences people have and talk about the group of people that are working on this. You talked about it being a cooperative thing, that there are members from each of the craft mediums that are in the group. But can you talk about being a concerned citizen of the community before you were involved with this at all? And then figuring out like, what can we actually do? Like, how did you get from your own desire to make a change to helping to found the organization itself?
You know, someone came to me with the idea, and I was excited about the opportunity to do it because it seemed like a rare chance for direct social action in a sphere where that doesn't often happen, and I think should happen more often. This feels like work that needs to be done, and we're happy to do it. We're staying anonymous, you know, like partly because we fear retaliation ourselves, but also because we don't want the story to be about us, really. I think it's enough that the platform exists, and we want the story to be about what people are submitting.
To wrap up, can you plug the both the website and how people can follow the feed?
Yeah, absolutely. So the feed is on Instagram at Craft Equity, and our website is craftequity.org. And you can find there links at either place, links to our Google form to submit a story. You can also find on our website a list of resources that can help with social work or legal resources. We are also represented pro bono by a law firm in New York, Crum Miller PC, that is offering to facilitate anonymous communication with institutions that have harmed a submitter or a person who has harmed a submitter. So if people are looking for redress for the harms that they've suffered, we have some resources to help with that. So check it out.
Thank you for doing the work that you're doing, and to the other folks that are behind Craft Equity. Just the resource pages alone, like just the resources you guys have put together, it is such an easy, accessible way for people to find the information, much less the post and the feed itself, which I've benefited from greatly. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to thank Craft Equity for doing the work that they're doing. A project like this is not easy to come together, so I really appreciate the organization they're doing on the back end with the goal of changing all of our experience in the field of craft. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.